what I'd like to do today is really two things. One, I'd like to preview for you some important new direction for Trout Unlimited. But then I also want to celebrate some of the accomplishments, and I mean a really small smattering of the accomplishments over the past year.
We are here to be the positive change in our communities. By protecting public lands, we are safeguarding the birthplace of our rivers and upholding the promise of places that belong to all. In reconnecting these places, we are keeping water in our stream banks and utilizing floodplains, thereby lessening the impact of drought, flood, and fire. By restoring degraded streams, we are removing toxic chemicals from our water supplies and providing usable habitat to fish and wildlife populations. Our science-based approach provides foundation and innovation to our conservation efforts throughout the country. We are the ones who show up again and again in state capitals, in planning meetings, at schools, and community events. By making our communities more connected to their rivers and to one another, we are working toward a better, safer, cleaner future. Through outreach to youth and veterans, we are passing along the wonder, healing, and peace that come with the power of water. From the headwaters to the sea, we are not daunted by the challenges we face. Quite the opposite, in fact. Trout Unlimited is here to serve. We are here to get things done.
Our landscape scale approach to conservation is fairly straightforward. You've all heard this many times. What we do is we work to protect the headwater streams where the sources of all the cold, clean water are. Because fish need to move in response to flood and fire and drought, we then work to reconnect those protected areas to downstream areas, and then we engage in watershed scale restoration. What's neat about this model is that it also happens to be a really effective climate change adaptation model. And what I mean by that is we're helping to recover the natural resilience of these rivers and streams so that they're better able to withstand the effects of floods, fire, and drought. Now, most of us are here because we love to fish. But the fact is that our approach and the work that we do on the landscape has huge benefits to people who don't fish. So consider when you protect a headwater stream, when you protect a roadless area or designate a wilderness area, what you're doing is you're reducing the downstream water filtration costs. And when you reconnect a river to its floodplain, you're diminishing the effect of the next flood on downstream infrastructure. And finally, when you engage in that watershed scale restoration that I was describing, you're providing hundreds, thousands of family wage jobs in communities across America. And this is the basic work of Trout Unlimited. Now, the accomplishments that you see up here, these reflect the national organization. And it's my hope that within a year or two, we'll be able to describe the totality of all of the work of the organization, from the chapter level to the council level, all the way through the national organization. Next. This describes the volunteer hours. Obviously, we had a downturn during COVID. It's hard to volunteer when people aren't allowed to be together. Some chapters did a really good job of overcoming that. We celebrated one last night, the Maine chapter. But even with the reduced amount of volunteer hours that we had in 2022, that's worth the equivalent of $15 million. So still very significant contributions. Next. This reflects chapter and council revenues. The year 2019 is a bit of an aberration because we had an 18-month filing there. But this year we set the record for revenues at the chapter and council level. So congratulations to you all for that. You know, we had a record-setting year at the national organization as well. We closed last year with $77 million in revenue. I want to pay attention to that big green or yellow blob that you see there. That is public financing, public funding, if you can't see it. What that means is it's state and federal agencies who are contributing to our mission work. And just yesterday, I'm pleased to announce that we closed our largest grant agreement ever by an order of magnitude with the U.S. Forest Service for $40 million over the next 5 years. So this, yeah. And I'll tell you why that's really important. If you cross-hatched the Greenlands outside of this state, actually, outside of Maine, where there's not a significant national forest presence. If you crosshatched the green Forest Service lands over native fish strongholds, it's a direct correlation. It's an absolutely direct correlation. This is all a result of the infrastructure bill that passed, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and I think you should expect to see more good things coming to TU as a result of that. The problem that we face, though, is that in spite of the incredible amounts of volunteerism, in spite of the great revenue generation that we're doing at the chapter and the council and the national level, we're still falling behind. Trout and salmon are still falling behind. The map that you see up here on my left is, it shows the extent of habitat of 28 listed Pacific salmonids listed for protection under the Endangered Species Act. And I don't need to tell people in Maine about the plight of Atlantic salmon. That's even worse than many Pacific salmon. And our own State of the Trout report documented that of the 28 trout species that historically persisted in the United States, we've lost 3 to extinction already. And of those that remain, fully 3/4 of them occupy less than 1/4 of their historic habitat. So the question we've been asking is, what can we do to increase the scope and the scale of our work so we can get ahead of what is, frankly, an extinction crisis? And you'll note in our new vision statement here, we put a real emphasis on communities. You'll notice that we don't even mention the word fishing. Now, for most of us, fishing is the front door to Trout Unlimited. But the fact is that gravity works cheap and it never takes a day off. Everything we do on the land is eventually affected by the quality of our waterways. Our new vision statement, it reflects the universality of our mission. It may be that the work that we do supports hundreds and thousands of communities where most of the people there don't fish, but that's just okay, right? That's another way to get a bigger boat, as what was his name in Jaws? Berkeley? Who was it? Schneider? Brody, thank you. And similarly, with our vision statement, you'll see a real emphasis on diversity. And the reason we're putting that emphasis there is it's our belief that the more that younger people, the more that women, the more that people of color, the more that indigenous people can see themselves in Trout Unlimited, the stronger we'll become. In nature, diversity begets resiliency. And we believe that to be the case for our organization as well. So we're taking what I have likened as the Tom Sawyer approach to conservation. So you'll recall that Tom got in trouble with his Aunt Polly for being annoying, and he was made to go out and whitewash the fence. And eventually, his friend Ben came by, and Tom seemed to be having such a good time whitewashing the fence that by the end of the afternoon, Ben and 11 other kids were whitewashing the fence for Tom while he sat under a shade tree sipping lemonade. Now, I'm not suggesting we sit under the shade tree and sip lemonade, but like Tom, to the extent that we can get our partners in other conservation organizations, in state and federal agencies, to make our agenda their agenda, or for us to make their agenda our agenda, the more we'll, instead of leveraging tens of millions of dollars a year, which is what we do today, we'll be leveraging hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And that's what's behind the priority waters concept. And so up here you see a good representation of what our volunteers and staff and partners did in Maine. They identified 15 priority watersheds. They used attributes like brook trout strongholds, heritage fish areas, critical habitat for Atlantic salmon, climate change factors, and they came up with these 15 basins. We're doing the same process all around the country. And by the first of the year, probably, we'll be able to actually go out and implement and communicate with everyone what our priority waters are. But I wanted to give you a sneak peek at the good work of our Maine folks. Another pivot that we're making this year is relative to engagement. So you're all familiar with our typical engagement model. It's basically we pound you over the head and shoulders with direct mail until you finally succumb and you write a $35 check. I mean, no joke. 80% historically, and Peter Barber is making some changes here, we're reducing this by a minimum of 20% this year, and it will continue to decrease. But we could hit you up to 76 times a year asking you for money. So we do that because it works, but we're pivoting. We're cutting that back by 20% this year and probably more in the future as Peter and his team come up with engagement models that are more digital driven or just experiential. One of the things I've learned, though, over the past couple of years in talking with the staff and talking with chapter leaders is that the vast majority of people who come to our tree plantings or community science projects or take advocacy actions for us, they're not actually members of TU. They're just people who like our work with kids, and they like our work with veterans, and they like our work in rivers, and so they want to participate. So what if we could leverage technology and find a way to find out what those people are interested in? First, find out who they are, find out what they're interested in, and then rather than pound them with direct mail, share information with them about the interests that they say they care about. And our belief is that they'll want to then stay more engaged with TU. Maybe they'll become members. They may not ever go to a chapter meeting, but they still will support that important mission work, and that's the key thing. That's how we get a bigger boat. So what I'd like to do now is, this is the part of the presentation where I have more fun. What I'd like to do now is talk about some of the accomplishments over the past year in the context of our core values as an organization. And the first one of those values is that we're united, right? We do very few things at TU, but the few things that we do very, very well. This year, the Vol Ops team came up with this really cool idea called Plant for the Future. And the idea was to have simultaneous tree plantings all across the country. We had 45 tree plantings, planted over 15,000 trees, had 750 people participate in this event. At the same time, it's actually not the same time, but through the course of the year, there was an effort in Michigan. I think they were called the Tree Team or the Dream Team. They planted over 31,000 trees. In Michigan alone, I am convinced that this whole effort at carbon sequestration through tree planting is going to become a huge book of business for Trout Unlimited in the future. We probably plant hundreds of thousands of trees per year. We're just not able to actually capture that yet, but soon we will be able to. So the Smith River is the only river in Montana that you're required to get a permit to float. It's 59-mile distance. And a few years ago, a Canadian mining company proposed to build a massive mine in the headwaters of the Smith. Does that sound familiar? Anyway, the mine would generate 13 million tons of acid-generating waste. And they came up with this innovative approach to taking care of that waste. What they were going to do was they were going to mix it all with concrete and then leave it there. I'm not joking. And so we didn't think that was a very good idea. So we and our friends at the Montana Environmental Information Center, American Rivers, and Earthworks, Montana TU and TU, we litigated that decision, that permit decision. And I want to read to you what the judge wrote in her ruling. Now I'm in stereo. If I can find it. She said, this is a quote. This is what's called a legal spanking. DEQ's decision to permit the Black Butte copper mine was arbitrary, capricious, and unlawful. So thanks to, yeah, that's right, cheer that one. Thanks to Trout Unlimited, that mine is now not being built. I do believe that that decision will be appealed, but thanks to TU and our partners, right now the Smith remains a safe place. Okay, speak of the devil. Bristol Bay, this effort in Bristol Bay is unlike any other conservation initiative I've ever worked on. It brought together people in a way that in a way that I've just never seen before. And just to give those of you who have been sleeping for the past 15 years the backdrop, after several years of advocacy, in 2014, we convinced the EPA to use its authorities under the Clean Water Act to prohibit industrial-scale mining from the headwaters of Bristol Bay. That decision was litigated by the proponent of the mine. And in 2017, EPA actually settled that litigation with the mining company and said, you can go ahead and file for a permit. And then what happened was in 2019, EPA, they pulled the protections that had been afforded to Bristol Bay in 2014, right? So, and TU litigated that decision. We litigated that pulling of the protections. And then remarkably, in 2020, the EPA and the Corps of Engineers actually denied that key permit that the proponent needed to build the Pebble Mine. And in 2021, the Ninth Circuit ruled in our favor in that litigation that we filed. And EPA actually cited that litigation in 2021 in reinstating the protections from 2014, but then expanding, and they actually broadened them. They made them broader than they were in 2014. And they cited our litigation as one of the reasons they did that. We never quit. We never wavered. We never gave up on those Alaska Native villages. We never gave up on those lodges. We never gave up on the people of Alaska. And we are this close to permanently protecting Bristol Bay. One of the challenges of conservation is that we are literally overseeing loss as advocates, as conservationists, whether it's loss of native species, loss of water quality, loss of wetlands, I could go on and on. In fact, Aldo Leopold, the great conservationist and one of my heroes, once famously said that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Most of the damage to the land is quite invisible to laymen. And an ecologist must either make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the mark of death in a community that believes itself well and doesn't want to be told otherwise. And yet, as anglers, we are optimists, right? And fly anglers, we take that to a wholly different level. We willingly, joyfully stand in freezing water, often in freezing temperatures, and cast a combination of fur and feather and wire at river ghosts. And there's not one among us that doesn't think at the end of the day that we will catch the biggest fish of the day. Trout Unlimited is in the business of hope. This idea that we can take specific steps today to make the world a better place for our kids tomorrow, it's the most optimistic and forward-looking and hopeful idea that America ever gave the rest of the world. And that is our business. So I have to admit that I'm a bit of a sucker for salter brook trout. So there Jeff Dabe up there, folks. Here he is, disrupting my talk. So, you think you're a seasoned angler, and then you discover these cool brook trout that move from the freshwater to the salt, and they can grow up to 4 inches in a single winter. And so a few years ago, our science team went out and assessed potential salter water in the area, and they found like 450 streams. I may have that number wrong. But roughly half of them were unassessed waters. They didn't know if they had salters or not. And so Jeff Reardon and many volunteers from Maine, they really wanted to focus on the eastern part of the state, and they did. But the Merry Meeting Bay chapter, which is adjacent to us here, adjacent to the Sebago chapter, they wanted to focus on their home waters. And by gosh, they found 8 salter streams that drain into Casco Bay. One of them is Frost Gully Brook, but like so many New England rivers, Frost Gully Brook is bisected by 3 dams, 3 deadbeat dams. 35 years ago, one of them provided water to Freeport, and the other 2 are owned by a conservation trust. And the cool part of the story is when the chapters and Jeff went to the conservation trust that holds 2 of the dams, the first things out of their mouth was, when are you going to help us get rid of these dams? And the good news is these dams are probably going to come out this year. One of the things I really appreciate about our members and supporters is that you all understand that conservation is a really long game. It's often 3 yards in a cloud of dust. These initiatives, Bristol Bay is a great example, they can take 15 years and they're still not resolved, but we're close. In Oregon, our Oregon director, Kristen Rivard, worked with a collaborative group on something called the Oregon Forest Accords. And so Oregon had some of the most outdated, antiquated regulations for management of private forests in the country, even though they have incredible fish values, these private forests. Well, Kristen worked with a team that was appointed by the governor over many years, and this past year they not only secured an agreement, they passed that agreement into law that was signed by the government, or by the governor, to protect 10 million acres of private forest in Oregon. And I want to read a letter I got. Chris, thank you so much for the time and energy you and your Oregon team invested in the Oregon Forest Accord. This historic agreement would not have happened without Kristen Rivard's incredible leadership, determination, and knowledge. I look forward to continued partnership as we work to preserve the bounty and beauty of this country. With much gratitude, Governor Kate Brown. So, in addition to the agreement that we have with the Forest Service, one of the many good things that came out of the infrastructure bill was the reauthorization of something called the Abandoned Mineland Fund. So the Abandoned Mineland Fund has raised billions of dollars to clean up abandoned coal mines in Appalachia and in a couple of western states. This is a bit of an aside, but part of the problem we have with hard rock mines is that there is no analog to the Abandoned Mineland Fund. That's something that we're working on. We're trying to get Congress to pass a bill to create a levy on the production of hard rock minerals so we can start to get ahead of this, these abandoned mines that we have in the West. But this is a typical Pennsylvania acid mine drainage affected stream. And before the passage of the infrastructure law, Pennsylvania could have expected to get about $65 million a year in AML funding. Because of this, the infrastructure bill, they'll now get $215 million a year for the next 15 years to really help us get ahead of the curve on this abandoned mine problem. And, many people have worked on this issue for many years. You've heard me describe TU as the patron saint of forgotten environmental causes. This is one of them. But one person in particular labored heroically on this issue and has labored heroically for many years on Good Samaritan legislation and a whole host of other issues. For 30 years, Steve Moyer has been our most able advocate and one of the most respected people on Capitol Hill. So let's all stand and celebrate Steve's 30 years of contributions to TU. Where is he? He's up at the top going like this. I'm fairly certain I'm going to pay for that. Thank you for doing that. Steve hired me 20 years ago now, and it's been a privilege every day to work with you, pal. So, TU, we bleed partnerships at every pore. We don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you care about conservation, we want to work with you. TU brings people together. We quite literally bridge difference. It's what we do. And partnerships are absolutely vital to that. So the Battenkill is a really famous river. It's a couple hours away from here. But in the 90s, longtime anglers began to notice a strange thing. We had a lot of large fish still, and a lot of very small fish, but all the middle year classes were missing. And they noticed, frankly, much like this picture, that the system was bereft of large wood. And so some of our chapters, what they did is they went out and they worked with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they installed some large woody debris structures. Basically, that large wood component that used to be alongside riparian areas was clear-cut 100, 150 years ago. And so they went back in and put the wood into the river that should have been there, but for clear-cutting. And what they found after a year or two was remarkable. They went back in with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they shocked these streams to count the fish and find out what happened. There was a 5-fold increase in trout populations. And they were across every age class, including a really healthy population of 18-inch fish. So the chapters then got together, and they came to TU National and said, and our friends at Orvis were very much a part of this, and our friends at National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, who we honored yesterday, they came and said, hey, look, we'd love to start a home rivers initiative here in the Battenkill. And they helped us to hire a home rivers coordinator named Jacob. And this year alone, Jacob helped to plant over 1,500 trees. He did a really important reconnect project that opened up some historic spawning and rearing habitat that had been blocked for years, and did a significant restoration using a lot of this large wood technique that was pioneered by the chapters. And the future looks really good on the Battenkill because of that. Another area where the grassroots really led the way was on the headwaters of the Snake. So a few years ago, I got a call from the president of the Jackson Hole chapter. And she said, look, if we put up half the cost of hiring a project coordinator, would TU National put up the other half, and we can start a home rivers initiative here, and working on really important tributaries like the Salt and the Gros Ventre. Other, it's almost without argument. I think the McLeod might have an argument here, but it's probably the best native trout fishery in the lower 48. And so we agreed to do that. But before we hired Leslie Steen, we actually had done a really cool project on a place called Spread Creek, where we took out a diversion dam and opened up 50 miles of habitat that had been blocked for 50 years. The problem is that over time, the structure that we replaced that diversion dam with began to entrain or entrap fish. And so Leslie led this past year a $1.5 million project to fix that. Let's listen to a little clip here.
Agencies and nonprofits like Trout Unlimited that are gonna put the time and resources into a project like this for the long term.
I think that part of the story of Spread Creek is a story of persistence. It's a story of resiliency, not just for the fish in the stream and our beautiful native cutthroat trout, but also the partnerships and the relationships we've built. I don't think that we would be doing the fish screen and funding all of the in-stream work that we need to do if we didn't have the strength of those partnerships and over time to really build a solution here that works for everyone.
This could be the last stronghold for cutthroat for a lot of places, and so the more we can do to protect this population, the better.
So like many other conservation organizations, TU's undergone this evolution over the past few decades. In the 80s and 90s, we very much worked at the point of impact on in-stream projects. And then in the late 90s and the early aughts, we realized we had to get out of the stream and up into the watershed. And increasingly now, we're working at even larger landscape scales. And the reason for that is building climate resilience. You have to work at larger and larger scales to be able to help recover the natural resilience of these systems. There's no better example of that than on the Upper Colorado. So the Upper Colorado is probably the West's hardest working river. It provides water for 40 million people. It irrigates 5 million acres of land. And for years, decades even, we had been in pitched battle with the people that manage that water, Northern Water and Denver Water. Well, enter Bud Isaacs. So Bud was a Vietnam veteran. He was in the 101st Airborne. He had a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart. And he was an oil man. And he was probably the single most effective advocate for the Upper Colorado. And he worked with someone who is similarly tenacious, Melly Whiting, to work with our now partner, Northern Water, to come up with the problem that was being created here at Windy Gap. So what happened here was this really cool blue, I think they called them blue ribbon streams in Colorado, was going into this reservoir where all the water was warming and then all the fish downstream were suffering. And so Northern Water and Melly came up with this very creative idea of building a bypass around the reservoir. And it's going to have all the natural sinuosity, all the bends that a natural stream would have. It's going to be an additional mile of blue ribbon trout stream, and we couldn't have done it without working in collaboration with people like Bud, but even with former adversaries like Northern Water. Let's just listen for a moment.
I think working with groups like TU and others is going to be important to us in the future. In the past, water users took their water and didn't worry about other people downstream. Now we understand the benefits of having high quality water, having a fishery, and having those people satisfied, as well as allowing us to meet our needs. So I think you're going to see agencies like Northern Water, Denver Water spend more time working with recreational and conservation groups in the future. It helps us and it helps them.
So that project was initially supposed to cost $10 million, and as things happen, it increased to $30 million. And Melly and Bud were undaunted. They went out, and through the good work of our partners at the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, Pepsi-Cola, and Intel and other partners, they raised that additional increment of money. And very sadly, very tragically, for those of us who knew him, Bud unexpectedly passed away this spring. And so when but 2 days before he died, he called Melly, and the last words he said to her were, "We did it, by gosh, we actually did it." So he died knowing that this project would get done, and we're scheduled to break ground on it this summer. Sometimes the best recourse is just to leave a river alone. Deerfield Watershed chapter of Trout Unlimited in Massachusetts had long suspected that they had naturally spawning brown trout in an otherwise hatchery-supported fishery of their namesake river. And the state disagreed with them. And so what the chapter did was they went out and they bought a boat, or they had a boat donated to them, and then the council and the chapter went out and they bought fish shocking equipment, and they donated the whole kit and caboodle to the state. And then the state went out and shocked, and lo and behold, they found out that there were twice as many, 2-to-1 ratio of naturally occurring, naturally reproducing brown trout to the stockers. And that's not all they found. They also found that the hydro operation there was causing some of these redds, or fish nests, to be left high and dry. And that resulted in a 2-year study, the conclusion of which I'm quite confident, because of the advocacy of the Deerfield Watershed chapter, we're going to have a new all-wild trout fishery in Pennsylvania, or Massachusetts. All right, this is a story of how a local chapter turned $7,500 Embrace a Stream grant, thanks to the great work of the Embrace a Stream committee. I think they're probably meeting now. Oh, they are, good, okay. Yeah, okay. They do every year, year in and year out. They never come to this damn talk because they're always working. But they're incredible, and we're lucky to have them, and they put a ton of time into this. But one of the projects they approved was a $7,500 project for the Chattahoochee chapter. So the Chattahoochee chapter in Georgia, they had observed that operations of their hydropower plant was causing this one unnamed tributary to have excessive erosion. And so they went in and they assessed, they walked up and checked out that tributary, and they found that it was loaded with this endemic, this rare crayfish. And I always want to say crawfish, but that's West Virginia. And so they petitioned the United States Geological Survey to rename, or actually in this case, name the creek Crayfish Creek. And GS agreed to do that. So it was now called Crayfish Creek. And then they worked with the Oconee chapter, and we celebrated yesterday the Georgia Five Rivers program, but with the Georgia Five Rivers program and other partners like Georgia Power, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation supported this, a whole host of partners, and they raised $250,000, and they did a really cool restoration where they peeled back all that erosion that was occurring. They reseeded the thing with native vegetation, 500 linear feet on each side of the stream. They removed an old culvert that wasn't working any longer, spent days pulling invasive species. I can attest that college-age kids are good for that. And then they reseeded the area with all native vegetation. And in so doing, they created really important spawning and rearing habitat for wild fish. Oh, you know, I wanted to read Connor Reynolds, the former chapter president, gets the last word here because I think he speaks to something that's so resonant with so many of you. He said, there are hundreds of these tributaries that need work. Ultimately, what we want to do is to restore as many as possible, one tributary at a time. So, as I mentioned earlier, we really believe at TU that diversity begets resiliency. We really strive to make sure that ours is an inclusive environment and that we're listening to more diverse perspectives and ideas because that makes our ideas better. A great example of this was the work of Derek Staub in Oregon. Derek met with the elders from the Warm Springs tribe over a series of meetings, and he listened to them talk about the importance of their mountains and listened to them talk about the importance of salmon to their culture. Eric then worked with them to develop a curriculum, and then they took hundreds of kids from the reservation and adjacent towns out into the woods, out by the creeks, to learn this curriculum, and I think this is something we're going to see a lot more of in the future. So Snake River salmon and steelhead are down to 1 to 2% of their historic levels, and that is a painful thing to have to say. But there is reason for optimism. 2 years ago, Congressman Mike Simpson, a conservative Republican from Idaho, proposed taking out the 4 lower Snake River dams, but replacing the social and economic benefits of those dams. The baton or the torch was passed or picked up, depending on your metaphor, by Governor Inslee and Senator Murray, both from Washington State. And then a few weeks ago, Rob and I were marveling at this yesterday. A remarkable thing happened. The federal government came out with a scientific analysis of the dams. And I want to read this to you. This was written by scientists in NOAA Fisheries and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And here's what they said. Bear with me, it's a little long. Salmon life cycles predict that breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams in combination with other fish protection measures will likely achieve regional survival and productivity targets for Snake River Chinook, salmon, and steelhead. The science robustly supports process-based stream habitat restoration, dam removal, breaching, and ecosystem-based restoration, and overwhelmingly supports acting and acting now. So that is, yeah, go ahead, applaud that one. That is the first time the federal government has acknowledged that the only way to bring these fish back is to take those dams out. Now, I may have taken a little bit of license with that interpretation, but it's really significant. And what changed? Well, I think Congressman Simpson deserves a lot of credit for changing the dynamic. But what really changed was the engagement of the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce have been dogged and have refused to give up the fight to bring back these salmon, which are so culturally important to them. And I've become friends with Shannon Wheeler, who's their vice chair, and I want to share with you something he told me. He said, salmon are the golden thread that tie us all together. When that part of our culture is in trouble, we are all in trouble. When salmon do not thrive, we suffer as a people. As salmon go, so do we. So at Trout Unlimited, we're not only science-based, we're truly science-driven as an organization. And increasingly what's happening is the science that's being developed by Helen Neville and her great team of scientists in Boise, but also by the distributed network of scientists that we have around the organization, is they're influencing our partners' work too, which is really important. Again, how do we get a bigger boat? This is how. A good example of that is some of the good work that Jake Lemon and Matthias Bonzo, thank you. How did I forget that name? That Jake and Matthias are doing in their use of drones. What they're doing is they're mounting thermal imaging equipment on these drones, and then they're flying rivers on the Asable, our birthplace, the birthplace river of Trout Unlimited. They're flying rivers and they're flying tributaries, and what they're doing is they're looking for seeps or springs or basically wherever the cold water inputs are. And the reason that's important is then our partners at the Forest Service and elsewhere are taking that data, and then they're using that to set their own protection and restoration agendas. You know, Jake and I were talking the other day, and we were both, you know, kind of thinking, you know, it's a little expensive. It's like $8 grand to, you know, equip one of these drones like this, but with a little bit of money and a little bit of training, this is the kind of technology we could export all around the country through our chapters. Another area that TU really excels is in conservation planning across broad regional landscapes. Again, remember, we have to take a landscape scale approach. A good example of that is Dan DeWalter, one of our scientists in the Boise office, worked with a whole host of state and federal agencies to come up with a conservation plan for 40 separate species in the parts of the West that you see listed here. And what's cool about this effort is half of the team were people working on warm water fish, like, you know, desert suckers and pupfish and that sort of thing. And then the other half were people working on trout. And this will give us a chance to link up some of that research and restoration for warm water and cold water species. All right, you have all been very generous with your time. I'm going to close up here. I wanted to tell a story about a guy named Scott Simmons. So throughout his life, Scott suffered from anxiety, he suffered from depression, he suffered from addiction, he had PTSD, and like many of us, he found real solace and comfort in fly fishing. And here's a fun little clip of he and his son fishing.
Fish, lift up, you got it. Good job, Cooper. Good job. Yeah, buddy. Yeah. Woo!
Oh my gosh! Oh!
Yeah! Awesome!
Oh my gosh!
Got it!
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, buddy! Woo! On the dry fly, baby! Woo! Sweet! Nicely done, son! How cool is that? Yeah!
Wait! Damn! And I just came out crazy and got it!
Yeah!
And I was like,
Yeah!
So I talked to Scott last week, and he told me on the phone that fishing gave him a sense of purpose. And he told me that fishing made him a better dad. He ended up joining the board of the Twin Cities chapter in Minneapolis and helps lead their youth education work now. And on the phone, here's what he said to me. He said, fishing gave me peace of mind from all the trauma I had faced in my life. It gave me the courage to let other people help me. It allowed me to process the trauma. It gave me relief and showed me a path toward redemption. It opened my heart. A path toward redemption. I love that. Right? Yeah. So we live in a world today where our relationship with nature is broken. We live in a world where our relationships with one another are often strained and frayed. We live in a world where our communities are increasingly defining themselves by their differences as opposed to what unites them. Every time you all go out and plant some willows or plant some trees or otherwise take steps to care for and recover the lands and waters that sustain all of us, you are redeeming our relationship with God's creation. And every time you all go out and take a kid fishing or take a veteran fishing or otherwise engage people in stream cleanups, you are helping to redeem our connection to one another. Every time you reach across the aisle to work with somebody from a different political party, or work with somebody with a different skin color, or work with somebody from a different socioeconomic background, you are helping to redeem community in an otherwise fractured world. Now, I am confident that somebody off the street here in Portland could have walked through the halls over there at the hotel and said, Trout Unlimited is just all about fishing. And the next time somebody makes that comment, I want you to think about Scott and Cooper. The path toward redemption is well trodden by all of you. And for that, I thank you. Oh. You are all very kind. Thank you.